everyone as you're joining. We're just going to give people just a few minutes to enter. We were talking earlier about how I think a lot of people are moving from meeting to meeting, so the changeover point needs a little bit of space. So just a few minutes and then we'll get kicked off. Thank you for joining us today. In the meantime, Tim, we can see a reflection of, in fact, maybe we can use this time to actually get the overview of the An Garda Síochána Innovation Centre. Maybe while we're waiting, Tim, you can give us a little look around where you are there.
Yeah, I can certainly be happy to. We've basically built an innovation centre or a digital hub, or depending on what area you're in. Some people don't like the word innovation anymore. It's moved on. So we've built ourselves, we've taken an old control room and turned it into a space where we can envision and try things. So I suppose you can see on the wall, we have a video running and we have some analytics running. And then over on the far side, hopefully if I stand close to it, the camera will actually go and show you we have a flip running as well. So we can actually do handwriting on the big screen behind us. So the room seats about 20 people. We were hoping that we'd have the presenters panel in here.
That's right.
And we could actually all present from the same room, but we are where we are. And but we got this thing built during lockdown, so I suppose we're proud that we could actually start using it as an innovation centre to start envisioning our world. And it's something I was tasked to do as part of a commission for the future of policing in Ireland, to basically set up an envisioning centre to help people to work with us and help small companies and SMEs to work with us to further the policing ideas of things we're trying to do in the innovation space.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm so sorry we can't be there in person, and that was our original intent. So thanks very much for sharing that with us as we were waiting for people to join. We'll probably get kicked off now. So thanks to everyone who's come along to today's event. This is another in a series of events for Open Ireland Network. I'm practicing pointing at the logo now that we have a lovely new logo. But for those of you who are not familiar with this group, it's a voluntary group that came together about, I think it was in February 2021. We started off with just a LinkedIn group. It's basically a community for folks interested in the open ecosystem in Ireland, mostly around open source, but also connecting into the open data and open hardware and open science and open research and open innovation groups. So there are lots of groups around the place who are doing amazing work, and one of the things we noted were that they're not necessarily all connected to each other here locally, and that's what we're trying to do, less from a technical perspective but more to be able to discuss the opportunities and blockers and talk about how we can raise awareness about those both opportunities and deal with the blockers here in Ireland. So it's about a community coming together to try and make an impact locally. So in that vein, we're here today to talk about open source and government in particular, and I want to thank some of our members who are in government who made us aware of the Innovation Week that's happening with our public sector, and we're delighted to do this in conjunction with them to help share the stories about what's happening in Irish public sector around open source, but then also hear about some things that are happening globally so that we can actually hopefully improve again what's happening here and look at opportunities abroad as well. So without further ado, we're going to kick off our opening panel, and I am delighted to be joined here by some amazing folks from around the Irish public sector. So I'll do a very, very brief introduction, and you can all wave as I mention your name. So, well, I mean, your names are on the actual Zoom screen, so this won't be too hard, but nonetheless, it's always nice to wave. So first of all, I'd love to welcome Dr. Mihai Beluca, who's from the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. Hi, Mihai, lovely to see you. We also have Garma Kriesta from the HSE, who has been the product lead on the CoTracker app here in Ireland, but is also the chairperson of the Public Health Advisory Committee for Linux Foundation. So lovely to see you, Gar. Tim, we heard from a little bit earlier, but he's coming to us live from An Garda Síochána's new innovation centre. And Tim is the head of digital services and innovation in An Garda Síochána. And we have Tony Shannon, who is the head of digital services from the Office of the Government CIO. So lovely to see you, Tony. So thank you all so much for joining us. So a great spread of folks from Irish public sector. And I am certainly looking forward to hearing some of your stories that's happening, because one of the things we've noted in previous events is that there's so much happening in Ireland, but that people don't know about. So, and maybe I'll start with you, Mihai, because we talked, I think before Christmas this year, like last year, about what was happening when you were back in Limerick. But since you've moved now departments, maybe you can give us a little bit of history about your own experiences with open source in both local government and now in terms of a departmental level.
First of all, Claire, thanks for the invitation to this panel, and it's really I'm delighted to be part of this discussions and to be promoting open source, promoting open standards, and to be promoting anything that's open, and basically anything that gives back to the community, not just the knowledge, but also the opportunity to improve on each other's efforts. And I think that's something really powerful. I think that just fundamental principle of let's all work together to create something better without having any particular commercial interest in it, it's something really powerful. I have started in Limerick to adopt open source for a wide variety of technologies and solutions, ending up with a full replacement stack for a proprietary system or a range of proprietary systems. So open source has been demonstrated, and we've demonstrated that it can deliver more value than source code that's locked or proprietary code. Starting from email solutions, directory services, website development, customer relationship management, virtual desktops, a plethora of our solutions that were free to install and delivered better results than proprietary code. So that was very exciting for us to engage with. And
I know as well, I might add, because you haven't mentioned it yet, but the website development you did was award-winning down in terms of for the city of Limerick, isn't that correct in terms of the actual end result? Yeah, so you might want to mention that. Go on, mention it.
Okay. No, look, I was very fortunate to work with the team that delivered the website on an open source platform on Drupal that has been selected as one of the best 25 websites in the world in 2017 by an international consulting firm based in the USA. And we are very proud of that result. It's excellent.
It was really good. But now you've actually moved from the city of Limerick, and now you're in the department. You're in the department with a very long name, which I have to keep looking at to make sure I get it right. So the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. So can you tell us in terms of your future plans and where you see the opportunity for open source in that context?
Well, our future plans and my future plans are, first of all, to continue the excellent collaboration I've had with Gar, team, Tony, and others, and to keep growing the community and keep exploring ideas on how we can deliver more with open source. I see three opportunities, at least three opportunities. One is obviously in digital services development, where web platforms that are open source provide a lot more opportunities for development, and I find them to be a lot more powerful for delivering online services. Secondly, I see huge opportunities in using open data platforms, and that is in particular relevant to development of smart cities, regions, and communities. At the end of the day, if we will see smarter, more sustainable, resilient communities, we will see them enabled by open standards and open technologies. And the third aspect where I see a lot of opportunities is in modeling, in scenario modeling, in optimization, and in predicting various impacts that some actions may take. For example, and I'll just be more specific, is we have developed a tool called the Housing Needs Assessment. Because I work for the department with a very long name, the Housing, Local Government, and Heritage Department, Obviously, a key challenge for us is to look at the needs of housing and understand the impacts of various policies that we make. In that context, a modeling tool is something that we would like to share with the community and maybe bring other jurisdictions and other countries that have a similar challenge to make a contribution towards the global knowledge of how better housing can be delivered to local people.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Mihai. And I think you're spot on when you're talking about things like smart cities, because it does seem that, in particular, when we think about the kinds of services that cities require, they're quite similar the world over. Everyone has a transport system. Everyone has probably housing problems, but some more than others. But at the same time, these challenges you've described are very common. So those kinds of opportunities, not only for collaboration across our public sector, but also internationally, become incredibly important. And so, Gar, actually, I might come to you next, because I think you have experience in this, having built the CoTracker app and knowing about how that works from an international perspective, how important it was to have international collaboration. Perhaps you can maybe briefly comment on that, and some of the trends that are happening in public health around open source as well, please.
Yeah, so I guess this is one of those areas where, so CoTracker kind of happened. We've all lived through COVID, so we're not going to labor that particular point. But the interesting thing that happened around the start of this and how CoTracker evolved was everybody was trying to solve the same problem simultaneously, but at a global scale. So there was like 40 to 50 teams, and they were all at a national level, all working. There was research teams from universities, and this was all happening in parallel. And the common characteristic that worked across, and it wasn't all of them, but most of them, was that they open sourced the code because it was a way of sharing knowledge, sharing learning, sharing information, right? And it became kind of the default. And it became a way to understand that somebody else is actually trying to solve the same problem, and they could show you and you could give feedback. And as a way of communicating, I think it's a far different way of thinking about solving the big problems that we've got. Now, we didn't all coordinate all together all at the same time. And as usual, some tribal divisions kicked off straight away, because there's always going to be one group that goes, oh, we have the solution. We have the silver bullet of silver bullets. And then somebody else, oh no, we have the silver bullet. And there was like schisms inside of it, but then it comes together. But in terms of the ability to deliver something in a very short time frame under intense pressure, and to solve a problem that was a complex problem, it demonstrated how this can work. And it wasn't just that it was public sector organizations, it was public sector plus private sector plus academia plus some of the larger tech platforms who were collaborating together in a very open way to do these kind of things. So it showed the best of what we can be if we work in this way. And that worked particularly well in terms of kind of bringing that in. And Tim was involved all the way through on that. And Paddy Baxter is now behind and doesn't realize that he's on the screen.
Nice to see you, Paddy.
Funny moments, and maybe Paddy's last moment in Garda headquarters. So I think Paddy saw me and thinks that's the only person he's talking to. So I guess if you go back to that thing about where this fits in and how it's evolving, so we've since then, so the eHealth network, which kind of operates across Europe with all of the health departments. So we've been working, so from an interoperability perspective across Europe, and this has not just been for kind of CoTracker. So it started with CoTracker, and for anybody who's been involved in big EU integration projects, they take a long time, right? They're big, and you agree standards, and we did this. It was done in 3 months, right? So, and that's unheard of. And then the same pattern was applied again for the digital COVID certs, and it's effectively the same architecture built on top of the same platform, all open source, and everybody could use it. And we got the reuse of that within 9 months. We were building the same thing again to support another challenge that we were kind of facing there. So we're seeing kind of this evolve, and we're seeing the communications between health organizations. So you've got formal meetings that happen through the eHealth network. There's informal things that are happening on top of Linux Foundation, the public health project, on Slack channels that are just bubbling up all the time, and conversations are happening. And people are exploring different ways of solving the same problem. So when credentials came up and the digital COVID certs came out, it began a kind of an exploration into how would we solve these problems, who's working on things in these areas, what are the various, so open standards became a thing, open platforms, so things like W3C verifiable credentials, so other things like that, which are kind of foundational pieces that we build on top of. they began to be explored by different groups who could bring expertise. So I guess it was a great way of finding people who knew things about stuff that we were interested in. So we were interested in solving the problem, but we, in some cases, had no idea how we would kind of make any progress on it. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying this is a very different way of tackling those big problems and really opening it up into, so it's not just me, Tim and Mihai and Tony having a conversation about it. We can actually expand that conversation globally and reach out to people through these networks to kind of go, okay, so if we want to talk to somebody who knows something about this or who has done that, it's much easier to bridge that divide and to bring those things in. So from a knowledge management perspective, it's incredible.
And I think, so I think one of the points that you made there about the time constraints, I think that's one of the most interesting things from my perspective about what was new about that. Not that it's a new thing, but certainly every conversation I had previously, as per Mihai just mentioned, like the idea of building on top of others' knowledge so that you don't reinvent the wheel is a well-known concept. Very sensible, right? But this idea that actually open source actually takes away some of the friction around collaboration. So it allows you to get straight to sharing stuff immediately. So there's not a kind of a discussion and then a 6-month lag while we work out IP and licensing and how do we do it. There's a kind of a framework there within open source to make those collaborations happen. And it just takes out some of that bureaucratic stuff from the process and allows it to happen much quicker. So, you know, for me, that's one of the most interesting things in terms of responding quickly to today's challenges.
Well, so if you take a very concrete example of that is, so the CoTracker app, the code for that is up in Linux Foundation Public Health Project now, right, as COVID Green. That's been reused in 11 different places and remixed. So because each group picked it up, took the foundations, and then remixed it to fit into their, and so there's bits of it being used. So they don't use the whole app in New Zealand, but they use components. In Northern Ireland, they stripped it out. In Scotland, they did kind of different. In Pennsylvania, they did something different. So each group remixed it to fit in with their public health response. So you've got the flexibility and the modularity to be able to kind of do those kind of things, but it accelerated the process. So the guys in Northern Ireland still think it was amazing value for them to kind of be able to do this because they were building on top of an existing investment and we had figured out how to solve the problem. Then they didn't have to figure out the foundations. They could talk to us and then just build on top and figure out the problems that they needed to solve. So definitely it's a game changer on that side of things.
But presumably they may also have problems that we may not even have thought about yet. They may have identified problems earlier that then come back to, that can benefit us in the future or anyone else who's using it in the future, right?
Well, that was the round trip. And I think so if we go back to the beginning for us was kind of transparency, then it turned into community. But then we started benefiting from it. And I don't think anybody anticipated that because we'd never really worked in that way before. But then when you see that we're actually integrating in things that somebody else has built into our app and then beginning to share those things kind of more broadly, it changes the way you think about this and changes the way even from a funding perspective, how you would think about organizing some of these things because it's a different model and you have to really apply, like there is an architecture lens to this in terms of how you think about putting things together.
Yeah.
And I think that the only point I will make on this, and myself and Tim, so this is not about writing more code. This is about trying to figure out how do we use, because there's a lot of stuff where there are problems solved. It's like, how do we remix and reuse and actually use the stuff? And I think that there's kind of been a tendency to go, we're going to open source it, which is about me building something new and I'm going to give it to everybody. But actually the use of, when somebody picking it up, it's like innovation, right? It doesn't matter until somebody's actually using it. Yeah. And this is the same thing. Writing the code it's good for you, but it's not good for everybody if you've open sourced it. It's only when you get a community and adoption that you see some benefit from it.
Yeah, no, it's certainly when the impact is when the adoption happens, and the more adoption that can happen, the better in terms of return on investment. That's where the return on investment really happens. But it's really interesting to talk about those funding models as well and how they may have to change in the future as you have multiple countries or different buckets of funding coming together, and how is all that allocated. So Tim, I might come to you now because I know that from the Garda Síochána's perspective, from policing in Europe, that there are also collaboration efforts going on. So perhaps you can give us a little bit of an overview of your experiences.
Yeah, so I think it fits exactly into what Gar was saying, that we can't solve all of the problems ourselves, but, policing like healthcare has been with us for generations. So I suppose part of when I started, I was new to policing and new to the Garda Síochána, but I was joining very quickly into a policing family across Europe in particular, where we used to have regular face-to-face meetings, and we still continue those virtually. But it very quickly, when I joined, certainly I found that the Dutch, the Danes, the Swedes, and the Irish had a particular synergy. And I think it was because we're all national organizations. and we don't have the potential problem that I know Mihai and I spoke for many years about, where you have different counties or different forces competing with each other to be the best within that country. Whereas we're above that, and we might have a little bit of competition to be the better country, but we were starting from such a low base. What we tried to do is think innovatively about how we could maximize the potential sharing that we could give and receive from the people that have been there for years. So we came up with and agreed an open architecture, even on a mobile device. So what we're doing is we're writing microservices on our mobile devices, which are based on the Android operating system. And it means that we can share code with other organizations. They're never going, as Gar said, they're never going to want the whole application. But the Swedish police took the application that we have for reading number plates. Obviously, their number plates are different and what they do with them are different, but the way we read plates is the same. And we've shared scanning applications with the Dutch police. The Danish police were looking at us going, we've built a whole series of apps that are completely, controlled and they're one piece of code. And they suddenly went, oh my goodness, we should have actually separated them out into what we have is an authentication app, a map app, a scan app. And all of those pieces of code are even reused by us when we're developing new things. So we're even reusing our own code, as well as other countries being able to contribute and participate in code efforts. And I think, while that isn't open source, I think the phrase that we call it is obviously inner source, where we're bringing, tick the box, where we're bringing code and sharing it between us across. And again, I think, Claire, in fairness to you, you've managed to do something that neither myself or Gar has done, is where we've actually got Tony and Mihai and the four of us on the same call at the same time. We actually haven't achieved this.
This is a Zoom where it happens.
I know, exactly. We've even tried this, and I think, Gar and Mihai both mentioned, the proprietary world, and I think when Tony lies awake with his deeper hat on, worrying about the amount of money that the government is spending on the same solution in 100 different government offices, that we all buy the same thing. And, I know he's trying to see, is there a way that we can open source some of those solutions so that we're not spending our money buying the same solution, but we're spending our money evolving the solutions to be the things that we need, rather than just going the proprietary route and saying, well, we all need a database, so we'll all buy this same database. And that is a standard, but it's a very expensive standard. Whereas maybe there's an opportunity, and again, this is what we're doing across policing, is they're looking at ways of, as Gar said, there's an awful lot of solutions out there, and we should get more prizes for reusing stuff than starting writing from scratch stuff that, and you're possibly rewriting something that's already there. And I spent a good amount of time over the last weeks, and I know Tony has, not stealing his thunder, but he spent a good amount of time looking at what existing stacks of things are out there that we can harness to do our business, rather than just saying, well, I can't be bothered looking at stuff, so I'll just go and buy things. And I think, it's up to us to have an open mind as well as an open infrastructure.
Well, thank you for that, and an extra prize for mentioning inner source. So for those of you who don't know, another of my hats is I work with Inner Source Commons, which is a global nonprofit promoting the use of open source methods and practices to create proprietary code. So it's a kind of a step on the path to open source, or it can just be used in the cases like Tim mentioned, where perhaps things are not ready to be open sourced, but they still want open collaboration between organizations or within an organization. But top marks for mentioning it. Thank you, Tim. But you were calling on Tony and calling out the kind of conversations that you've been having. So Tony, I'll come to you next. And I know we heard from you at the Open Paris Experience event on Monday about the work that you're doing in the Office of the Government of the CIO. So I think it'd be wonderful if you could share some of your kind of experiences so far and your plans for the future.
Sure, yeah, happy to do that. And it's great to be amongst kind of colleagues and allies here. And it's hard to follow up on some of the wisdom that's already been conveyed, but let me just introduce our work by kind of setting the scene in terms of a book that I use all the time, and you've heard this one before, Claire, but you know, we're talking about this century, this decade, you know, the 2020s has been a kind of a major decade of challenge for both people and planet. And I talk about a book called Donut Economics that I recommend a lot, which talks about kind of 4 key players in the way forward. You know, one is the household and citizens, the other is the state, and the other is the market, and then you've got the commons. And I think, you know, what we know is whether you look at COVID or you look at climate change or whatever is facing us over the next decade, and it's a critical one, you know, we got some pretty wicked challenges to try to tackle. And, you know, the gents earlier have already kind of alluded to the power, if you like, of the commons into kind of tackling wicked challenges. And that doesn't necessarily mean everybody doing their own thing, but it does mean trying to look to collaborate as best we can. So, you know, I think, you know, what we're doing, if you like, you know, GCO here is beginning a set of conversations with people around, you know, their digital maturity journeys, and talking about the common patterns that are there around people and process and technology, and finding that actually a lot of people actually, when you delve into the challenges they face, though they all may appear unique, there are actually a lot of common patterns in terms of processes that people are trying to improve, be it case management or identification or whatever those are. And people kind of struggle to see those, but when you put them in front of them, and we've done this with several of the departments already, we're doing a review or work with all of the government departments at the moment and asking them about these challenges. And it turns out that most people do recognize actually that there are many common processes that we're trying to work on together, many common components that could be shared that would be very useful to actually collaborate on together. But it's about trying to find, if you like, now some attractors within the system that would allow us to kind of focus our efforts on some key components. And you will hear later on from one of the colleagues internationally who's leading on GovStack. So GovStack, I think, is probably building on work that the UN ITU Foundation have already done on identifying some of these issues. Probably the smartest kind of, I suppose, elaboration of these key patterns and the key components we could be talking about. There's about 25 core building blocks that they've called out that could be useful for us to collaborate on. And they're things like identification, content management systems, data collection, you know, case management, as I say, messaging, analytics, those kind of big blocks that everybody here would mostly recognize. And the good news is that there's a lot of work done in the open source community already to actually provide candidates for those. And that's the thing, you know, we're not actually, maybe those of us who'd be having this conversation 10 years ago might have been seen as a little bit left wing or, you know, a little bit, you know, unorthodox. But actually the nice thing about open source now is that it's very much moved into the mainstream in the software industry. So if you look at any now software that's been released into the open, in the bigger picture, pretty much most open source is now the norm. So, you know, we have an environment now where the market sees the wisdom in that investment. We now have people on this call and others who understand that from a state's point of view, it makes lots of sense for us to actually put our heads together and kind of collaborate. There's a commons out there already, not just at a national level, but at an international level with building blocks ready to go. We can shift our services very much more in a more citizen-centric way if we start building, you know, with the principles of user-centric design and agile development and open source components in mind. And I think it's just a question as to how, you know, some of us get some of this momentum moving here now in Ireland. And I think Ireland's in a very good place to make the shift. The timing is right. The scene is set. You're doing a great job with Open Ireland Network to actually get the discussion going. And, you know, I would be optimistic that we can begin to change the direction here. But there's obviously a lot of work to do.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And I just see a question that's come up in the Q&A, and just to remind everyone that you can feel free to either put something in the chat or in fact the Q&A if you want me to have an ask of it with the panelists or with some of the speakers later on. But this is from Donal, and the question was around whether or not there were any, this is specifically for GAR, but I'm going to put this out for everyone because we do want to talk about the blockers. So, you know, are there any headwinds now? I mean, Tony, you mentioned that in the past it may have seemed more radical to be talking about open source software, but now it's kind of like the norm in terms of how a lot of things are being done. So what are the kind of headwinds that are going against the adoption of open source software today? Like, what are the biggest blockers? Because we hear a lot about the myths that may have been there in the past, but actually to some degree have been mitigated these days. But if I had to ask each one of you which you think would be the biggest blocker that we have to potentially overcome, what would they be? I'll start with you, Gar.
Thanks, Claire.
You just happen to be there on the screen. I'll go clockwise.
So yeah, the biggest blocker. It's I think that the challenge is that there's kind of there's a mindset, there's a baked in piece about how we think about doing change in organizations, right? Which involves us planning, and then we plan to plan, and then we plan and we do strategies and we do all of this stuff. And if we're going to do something big, we go through a fairly sizable procurement process. And because procurement takes a while, it ends up being big. So instead of it being kind of narrow and modular, I make it big because I don't want to have to do it twice, because it's painful running multiple procurements in parallel. So I effectively create a skip that I toss all my requirements in and I go out the door, right? And I say, solve all of these problems for me. And I can't clearly articulate what the problem is. And that in itself is a problem. So I'll let Tim talk about the problem piece of it now in a minute. So I won't go any further on that. But I think the issue is that if you look at where we all are, so you are where you are, right? You're at this starting point, and we keep going for this nirvana. When we're all done, it'll be amazing and won't it look wonderful, which is the current procurement process. And we need to break that into what I keep calling, if anybody's watched Stephen Colbert, he does this section in the show called Meanwhile. So meanwhile, while we're waiting on all this other stuff to happen, what can we do tomorrow? And this is the platform for doing things tomorrow and doing things with a sense of speed and urgency, and it allows us to start, because there's no obstacle in the way of that. So the obstacle isn't about the technology adoption. It's about just changing that mindset or creating a space to bring in this as an option to begin to look at solving problems. So
no, thank you. And
that's
we heard that earlier, just in terms of the benefits. One of the benefits is being able to break it down into smaller chunks that we can therefore understand what is common and what needs to be custom or whatever. So that seems to be a kind of common thread. Though think small wasn't really what I was expecting to hear, but I like it. I like it in this context. It's more quicker, more agile. So that's really, really great. Mihai, would you like to maybe comment on that quickly?
Yeah, I see actually two challenges that are important, something that I've actually experienced myself. One of them is the belief of IT professionals that only proprietary world delivers enterprise-ready solutions. I believe that belief is still prevalent in a lot of organizations, and that belief needs to change. And I don't think I'm wrong when I'm saying there is a belief that, if it's open source, no, that's just gimmicky. That has to change, because that's very powerful. And I believe that it has changed in the past 10 years and will continue to change. The second one is availability of companies in Ireland to provide enterprise-ready support for some of the solutions that we hope and wish to adopt. Obviously, the challenge for companies is we cannot provide service unless there is demand. But if we create demand and that demand is not met, as Gar mentioned, maybe through procurement, we do not get responses, then it's very hard to win against the commercial or proprietary world.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And again, I should mention that thankfully, when we've been getting together talking about the Open Ireland Network, in fact, the goals have been around making sure we get out there and change perceptions and showcase the kind of work that is being done, and the fact that enterprise, commercial off-the-shelf products can happen and still be open, and in fact, all the great work around that. But the second thing would be around the skills, and just to make sure that we are able to support the efforts in Ireland in terms of actually making sure we have the skills and capabilities in Ireland to do that. But as you say, and as said earlier, there's been a high growth in those areas. Are you going to say something?
Claire, I'm sorry to cut across you, but that thinking that nobody got fired for buying IBM, that thinking at executive level, at IT executive level, needs to be challenged. The idea of well, we need to pass on responsibility to someone, but it has to be a big name, because otherwise, no, we have a problem. But that, I think, is fundamentally wrong.
Okay, all right. Well, hopefully in the future it won't be that people, that there'll be no association with passing the buck in terms of doing this, and that it will be an actual something that people would aim for in terms of those international collaborations. Thanks, Tim. Do you want to mention briefly?
I think just following on from Mihai's point, I think the challenge is it comes down to risk appetite. In that, if you're deciding to break something from the big skip, as Gar said, into the microservices and this microarchitecture, and then you're deciding that actually I'm going to go away from the safe zone into what Tony kind of said 10 years ago, we'd have been branded the Mavericks and they would have just turned off the Zoom. If you're willing to go into that space, you are actually willing to take a risk, because at the moment, as Mihai says, there isn't a huge amount of support for all of the potential open source platforms. So you're then really taking that support on yourself, or you're maybe asking somebody of a support company to step outside their comfort zone to help you to deliver that. And again, that's the risk appetite that you have. But I think if we don't, and again, I think Tony's point will come in that if there's a set of tools that we all start to use, then when you build the tools, the support will come. And I think the other challenge that Gar referenced is, my phrase that I use continually in here and across the business side is love the problem, not the solution. That an awful lot of times people will come and say, I need this product. And you say, oh, right. And they're programmed with certain proprietary products. They're programmed to say, oh, I need this product. And you say, well, what problem are you trying to solve with that product? And they say, no, I need this product. And then eventually they get the product, potentially, if depending on how senior you are and how close to the budget they are. And that product doesn't solve the problem they have, but they associated that product with the problem they have. And I suppose what we're trying to do now is let's boil the problem and then see, can we split the problem into a series of potential products? We might end up with products, but at least we'll try and make them fit for purpose. Yeah. And again, going back to the microservice architecture, rather than just saying, oh, yeah, we need a big skip and we'll just go and buy a big product, and then it may or may not solve the problem.
Right. And I think that shared risk idea is so important as well, like just not only across departments, but then across, national boundaries even, and the more folks that we have it. And I know Stephen Wally is here shortly going to be talking about, how to maybe assess the kind of projects that would have lowest risk in that respect. So we'll be hearing from him shortly. But Tony, perhaps I can come to you now for the last word on what you think the challenges are that we need to address all together.
I think, again, I'm repeating some of what's been said, but it is an educational issue. I think what we know is that the market is shifting towards open source, but it's fair to say that actually that isn't widely understood in everybody. Let's say in the Dublin branches of the largest tech companies that are here. The tech companies that are here represent part of the global ecosystem, but we haven't yet seen, as far as I know, any Irish SME or any great big open source kind of innovation that's come out of these islands. It's happening around the world, but the Irish software industry is a relatively conservative part of the software industry internationally. And people might say that's a bit unfair, but that's certainly the way I read it. And along with that, I think the Irish public sector, along with other public sectors around the world, is relatively conservative. I mean, I think it's fair to say it's risk averse for all the obvious reasons that you'll know don't want to end up in the paper. So there's fear, there's uncertainty, there's doubt, there's the difficulty around procurement that Gar has mentioned. I think we have got to educate people that actually we are dealing with complex challenges. That the old style of change, which I'll call waterfall style of change, where you spend months on years on requirements and then analysis and then building and then deploying and testing, is fraught with risk and danger. And there's plenty of evidence of that. I don't need to cite some of the examples that already happened in Ireland to show that's not the way to do things anymore. What we should be promoting is user-centered design around the citizens and a more agile approach by and large. And open source fits very well with that. And I think it's an educational issue at all levels across the state and within the market. And we have to get that education right. Otherwise, people will continue to behave as they have been doing. So I was optimistic, and I am optimistic, but that education is part of the work that we need to do.
Well, that sounds like that's like putting it up to us, isn't it? In the Open Irish networks, or the Open Ireland network, even better get my name right. But I look forward to doing that and working with you all in the future to do that. And I know that you all have plans to get together to follow up this. We had a really nice little conversation just before the panel session, so I'm delighted that there's an opportunity to bring you all together to talk about further opportunities as well for collaboration. But I look forward to helping and seeing how we can get other folks involved in helping spread the word about these both opportunities and the great work that is actually happening in Ireland, because you'd be surprised actually how much stuff is coming out from Irish small SMEs. It's just that they don't promote it locally, right? Because they're also busy collaborating internationally, and there's actually no necessarily awareness about what's happening here in Ireland. So that'll be part of our job in the network as well, is to showcase some of those great solutions. So I just want to say thank you all to the panel today. Thank you, Gar. Thank you, Mihai. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tony. I really appreciate you coming along to share your stories here today. And I will ask you now to kindly turn off your cameras, and I will invite to the stage Mr. Stephen Wally, who is coming to us from the Microsoft office of Azure CTO in Microsoft. So hi, Stephen. We can hear you. Excellent.
And you can hear me. That's good.
Yeah, we're doing well so far. And thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's very early for you as well, and thank you for joining us for the meeting.
It's actually not bad, because I'm on campus at Johns Hopkins right now, so I'm only 5 hours out. I'm not
very good. Well, I still appreciate it. It's still pretty early. And I know you have had not just coming from a company like Microsoft in terms of the experience with Azure there, but you have over 30 years experience in the open source world. So you heard earlier, you might have come in at the end of the panel session there and heard folks talking about the idea of support and making sure that we can kind of get shared risk. And I know one of the reasons why I was so excited to get you here today was because I had seen some of the work you're doing in Johns Hopkins University, helping people learn about the idea of sustainable projects and what it means to be sustainable. So I'm hoping we're looking forward to hearing your views on that today, and I will get off the screen and let you get started.
Fair enough. Let me see if I can actually get this properly. And did I share the right deck? Folks are seeing something. Oh, I can't hear you, Claire.
Did the wrong thing. I was just going to say, looking good to me. Off you go.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. So good afternoon, everybody. My name's Steve Wally. I do work at Microsoft in the Azure office, the CTO. I'm also an instructor at Johns Hopkins University. I have the good luck and good fortune to be working with Saeed right now directly at the university. And I've been around the open source community for 30 plus years now, as Claire said, since before we had the open source definition. I guess the only other interesting thing about me is I'm a Canadian living in America kind of thing, and I've been here for 20 years now, so that still has its own challenges. I'm going to go through a lot of material in a short amount of time because I want to try and break open your thinking with hopefully some new ideas. I loved catching the end of some of the discussion there. There was some useful things that hopefully I can provide a kind of slightly different lenses to look at those challenges through. And Claire knows how to find me. So if there's other things you want to talk about in the future, I'm always around. So I just wanted to kind of start off with this idea that open source is unsustainable. And I am saying that with my tongue firmly in my cheek. But for the last few years, we keep hearing lots and lots of people struggle with this idea of sustainability. Nonprofits are struggling to identify significant projects, and individual developers are burning out and struggling to support their own projects. End users are struggling with insecure projects. We hear about that regularly. And then startups are struggling with their partners and users using the projects and not buying products. And I think part of that is we've ended up in this space because starting about 25 years ago with the rise of the web, software was democratized. There were many, many things that were democratized. Anything that could be digitized was democratized, and that distribution channel had to evolve, and the way things were curated had to evolve. The one thing that we never talked about through all of that change with, you know, books and movies and video and music and the rest of it, was that software, the thing that was already digitized, was also democratized. We now live in a world where, you know, anyone can be a net producer and publisher of software now. And we can see the results of this. I started talking about this in broad terms a few years ago. And at the time, if you pull the numbers from the GitHub annual Octoverse reports, you'll see this growth in the number of repositories. And it keeps getting worse. You know, by the time Microsoft acquired them, you know, that first year of ownership by Microsoft, they were up to 140 million repositories. And at this point, you know, the claims of last year, they picked up another 60 million repositories. And so there's, you know, I struggle with this because I'm afraid I take offense with Mark Andreason's comment from back around 2012. You know, software isn't eating the world. We're actually living in a world now where we're drowning in software, and most of it's mediocre, duplicative, and bad. So this is the state that I think we find ourselves in, and is where some of these challenges are coming from. I also want, there was something that Mihai just said that I think was really valuable. When he and Gar were offering their opinions, we're also in a space now where for a long time, open source and the discussion around open source for 20, 25 years now has grown in what you'd think of as IT infrastructure. And at this point, as the rest of the world starts talking about software, as you know, every company is a software company now, every company has to be a technology company now, we're seeing a rush into this software space from all of these other vertical industries. And they all think, oh, we have to do open source now. And they, you know, how do I do that? Because I want the next Linux, or I want the next Kubernetes platform level, you know, industry uniting software. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of the old myths that we thought we'd put to bed are showing up again, because we have this influx of new people, and it's accelerating. So what I want to try and do is quickly give you a couple of different frames of reference that I often use with groups of people to help them think about the problem a little bit differently. One of them's, I just walked the students through this one over the last few weeks as well, and that's that idea of cooking in software. And the other one is how human communities work and where you choose to live. So let's start off with the cooking idea. You know, we all know how to fry an egg. And, you know, if you practice a little bit, you may even get good enough to, you know, start to cook a meal for friends. You know, continuing down that idea, you might get comfortable enough that you start to tackle the holiday meal, and you may even start to specialize. You know, I happily live with a woman who is a brilliant baker. But the second that I say the word restaurant, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking a two-person taco truck or a chip wagon, all the way up through a Michelin-starred experience, now all of a sudden we're going from this idea to this idea. And this idea has consequences. You know, there are implications here suddenly. There's likely a team suddenly. There's no longer just me and my software. You know, you have an added layer of communication, even if it really is just, you know, two people in a chip wagon kind of thing, or two people in a taco truck. There's standards that have to be met and managed. There's needs to be reliable, repeatable delivery all the time. And then on top of that, you know, suddenly on the other side, you've got customers, you've got a business to run, there's regulations you need to uphold, there's, you know, money to be managed. And I mean managed. I'm not even talking about money to be made here. You know, employees to be hired and managed as well. And so you have the same problem in the software world. And I've grabbed, you know, kind of 4 logos. They are not random. These are companies that all have an affinity for open source. Microsoft maybe most recently over the last decade, but these are all companies that have a history with open source here. And so that's one of the framings, is to make sure that folks understand that there's this subtle difference and some not so subtle differences between the idea of an open source project and that idea of we now have a company that has products. The other frame of reference that I try to help people through is the community in your neighborhood. And we all live in the world of atoms, and we all choose our neighborhoods for very personal reasons. It might be our commute, our spouse's commute, where the kids go to school, family, friends, where we worship, what our hobbies are. But we all choose these neighborhoods for very personal reasons. And you basically have three sorts of neighbors living in your community with you. There's the people that simply want to live there. There's about 100 homes in the estate I live in. There's the people that report potholes and trash in the street, things like that. And then there's the people that actually organize the block party. I've had the privilege of living in 3 different countries now. Every culture has its own block party. And somebody in the neighborhood, somebody in the estate always organizes the block party. I don't know where we find them, but we're always lucky to have one. It's the same thing in your software project communities. And, this is a function of people. This isn't a function of technology. There are people that simply want to use the software. There's people that will happily report bugs and offer up ideas for features. And then there's the people that are happy to make contributions, to actually contribute code, documentation, use cases, tutorials, work on the release train, things like that. And the real kicker is, I learned some time ago that this is actually an orders of magnitude kind of problem. And the interesting thing about it is the first time I ever came across this was a little over 20 years ago. And I've been anecdotally testing it ever since, and it seems to hold. For every 1,000 users, you'll get about 100 bugs reported, of which 10 people will give you a patch, of which 1 actually read your contribution guidelines. And so it's really interesting the way that this works, because I have tested this idea in a room full of a couple of 100 people that self-identify as open source community managers. And you do the show of hands, how many people know how to report a street lamp out on your street? And in 200 people, you get about 20 hands go up. 20 people have figured this process out. And then hands down, and then you ask them, okay, so how many of you are the person that organizes the block party? And in a group of 200 people that self-identify as community managers, you'll only get 4 hands go up. That's 2%, which I'd expect to double the 1% in a room full of community managers. So I think there's kind of this thing going on here. But what that also means, another way to say this, is that for every 900 freeloaders, you'll get about 100 bug reports, of which 10 people might make a contribution, of which 1 of them actually read your guidelines. And that there's this idea that those people, those freeloaders, they still identify as members of your tribe. They are still members of the community. You're not a freeloader because you chose to live in the estate you're living in, and you don't actually report, the street lamps that are out or help organize the block party. At no point has anybody said, you're freeloading. This is just the way communities work. And, so there's this idea that freeloaders means you're doing it right. But these people are still members of your tribe. And I think folks have to hold on to that and kind of accept it. So there's a set of questions that I invariably come into when I'm starting to have these discussions with folks for the first time, and I'm trying to offer different framings for things. And the first 3 kind of come out of the world of, okay, you're creating an open source project, you're producing work here. And then the other 4 are very much questions that you'd be asking if you were consuming. To a certain extent, I'm going to stay focused for the rest of this talk on those first 3 questions. How does an open source project actually work? What's the purpose of an open source nonprofit, since we're seeing an acceleration in folks bringing projects to nonprofits at this point in history? And then what's the strategic purpose for sharing outbound? Just to give you a flavor of the open source project consumption side of the house, one of the key things you always have to ask is, who owns the software? Because so many small startups right now are trying to use open source licensing and a variation on community building as a go-to-market strategy. And we'll talk about that briefly. What's the health of the software engineering culture, as well as what's the health of the project community itself? These are important questions to be asking. And then what investment do you have to make to manage the risk of using that software? You know, the big aha for Microsoft was to realize that when you start dipping into these buckets and consuming these open source licensed components, that it's just third-party software. And Microsoft has a long history of using third-party licensed software in their products. So, you know, there's actually experience that they can leverage that way. When we're looking at producing things, I try and look at it from the perspective that you basically have, you know, 3 on-ramps that you have to build for project growth. You've got the core committers and working code. Those core maintainers, you need to start expanding to find as many users as you can, because that's how you're going to find the developers that are going to do something selfish. And those developers are the people you then want to turn into contributors. And so there's this idea that you're building 3 on-ramps. You know, how do you encourage people to use your project? And it's, you know, make it easy to install and configure and use it. Because that's where you're going to find these developers. And how do you encourage those developers to selfishly experiment? This goes back to some of the things that your panelists were just saying about, you know, that ability to actually reach into all these other buckets to test that software for their own needs. You know, that's the fundamental economic engine right there. But that means that if you are sharing, if you've created an open source project and you're sharing it outbound, you need to make that thing easy to build and test and experiment with. You know, so that a developer outside of that community can actually get to a known state in a relatively easy way without, you know, asking a lot of questions and troubling a lot of people. And then that last on-ramp that you really need to build is that how do you encourage those developers to then share their work back? Now, I can't emphasize this enough. This is not about altruism. This is about engineering economics. It's expensive to do fork management. It's expensive to be living on a fork, especially if you've got a reasonably active open source project that's continuing to evolve. So you want as much of your changes as you can possibly upstream back to that project, because that way your fork management is getting smaller and smaller and cheaper to manage the cost and manage the risk. So it's all about engineering economics. It's not about altruism. And then I keep trying to hammer home that this responsibility is, you know, it's very much on the committers, the maintainers, the community to be doing this. That idea, you know, going back to you know, cheekily paraphrasing JFK in his inaugural speech, you know, it's ask not what your community can do for you. There's no magic community that's going to come and help you build greatness here. You have to do that work to set up the conditions that will enable your community to grow. And so you end up in these places where it's, this is this idealized, you know, greatness of your open source project here. You know, you start off with some workable code, you've got some maintainers, you find some contributors, you build a community, and an ecosystem happens, and everybody's very excited. This is very stylized. It's a wonderful aspirational goal. You have to remember, though, that you are sharing outbound as those maintainers under an OSI license with no expectation of return. You know, if you build a community as well as publish the software, then you can actually capture that innovation, you know, new innovation back into your project. But when you create one of these, when you apply an OSI license, you are sharing outbound, and the license says people can do whatever they will. They're under no obligation. So that's where that second step of actually building a community is kind of necessary if you want to start capturing innovation back. But something happens along the growth. You end up with corporate contributors showing up. I say they're showing up. I'm not saying they're contributing yet, but people in companies think that this project is mature enough that they might want to use it in a product or service to their customers. You also get to a point where personal liability starts to intrude. You're holding a meetup. Do you rent the space on your credit card? No, somebody wants to sponsor it for you. Okay, so they're going to write a check into your bank account. And so suddenly personal liability starts to intrude on, you know, the community in the small as it's growing and as you're actually building things here. And the net effect of these kind of two, the corporate liability problem and the personal liability problem, is your evolution stops, and it'll stop cold. Basically, there's nothing to get past that. You know, companies aren't going to use something that seems to have this very mushy, like no provenance to the source code, no ownership to the source code, or it's owned by so many people that are all individuals. They get very hesitant around that because they need to manage their risk. And at the same time, the maintainers need to manage their own personal risk. You know, you don't want your mortgage on the line because somebody got drunk at your meetup, kind of thing. So there is a way to solve for this. And the way that you solve for this is this idea of you actually put a nonprofit into play. So you now have a legal corporation, it's a nonprofit corporation, but there is now a legal structure, a legal framework that manages the liability for you. That's what you're doing with these things. So from a corporate perspective, there's now, you know, you can get proper IP management in place. It provides a neutral level playing field for asset ownership. At the same time, individuals are no longer, the individual maintainers, the individual committers no longer own that personal liability. There's a bank account now that's owned by the nonprofit. The thing that was really surprising, a colleague and I, she was the executive director and I was the technical director of a small nonprofit in this space that did not make it. Not all of them make it. But we did a paper, that's the URL at the bottom, almost 10 years ago now. That was, near as I can tell, still to this day, the first time that anybody ever put a stake in the ground around this to say, this is what a nonprofit is for. This is how to think about a nonprofit. But that's the thing that enables that next wave of growth. And to put it in perspective, the Apache project, the original web server, was about 30,000 lines of code with complete, you know, anarchy and chaos around its ownership. Spring of '99. They put the Apache Software Foundation, they created the nonprofit and put it in place. And they did that with the help of a number of corporations that desperately wanted to use that code in their products. Within 3 months, the code base went from 30,000 lines to 90,000 lines of code. Now, that wasn't that suddenly a whole lot of code was written. It was that there was now a framework to contribute a lot of this forked code that had been out there in various different corporations. But that's the kind of growth that you can enable if you're being kind of careful with this kind of thinking. And we know that this works in a broad sense. A fabulous engineer in our broad community named Henrik Ingo. He worked for MySQL, he worked for MariaDB, he was at MongoDB, and I am blanking horribly on where he works now. He did a number crunch back in 2010, and the number crunch that he came up with basically demonstrated that the 9 largest, most vibrant project area, vibrant communities, were all hubbed in nonprofits at the time. He was a good engineer. He did not claim causality, but clearly there's a very strong correlation going on here. And the 10th was an order of magnitude smaller than those 9. So again, you know, not causality, but there's a clear correlation in how creating that nonprofit can enable that next level of growth. The big challenge right now, though, is we're seeing more and more companies now try and do this. So instead of something starting in the wild and growing, you know, a 21-year-old Finnish undergraduate creating an operating system 30 years ago, so to speak, you're seeing companies trying to create these projects. And this fails in a number of different interesting ways. There's the whole setting customer and partner expectations and community problem. And then there's those same kinds of things start to happen because they often rush these projects out. There hasn't been some gentle growth of people starting to, you know, create stuff around it and contribute. Many of them are, I have a great new idea, we have a little bit of working code, and they slam it out the door. And it's even more fraught because it's often your competitors are suddenly in the mix with the rest of that early community that you're trying to form. And I think part of the challenge here is really you have to step back and understand if you're a software company, or even if you're one of these new companies that everybody's a software company now. There's basically three kinds of software that you build. There's the core value proposition, and that's not the software. It's the software that enables your core value proposition to customers. And those customers are paying money for that core value proposition. Then there's the complement value add that is the additional components of the solution that makes the solution more complete for the customer. And then finally, there's that context. There's that tooling that you build for your own use as you build the other software. And if you look at them kind of back to front, if you have a context project, and an easy example here is Netflix publishes a lot of its tooling. So Spinnaker is its CI/CD pipeline, and things like the Chaos Monkey suite of testing tools, things like that. There's lots of good reasons to publish it and even build a small community. And you as the company can absorb any small amount of liability that lives in that space. But it gives you a lot of benefits for relatively small investment. Now, if you step up into that complement value add space, now you're starting to do something strategic. Now you're actually, as a company, thinking about, or you should be thinking about strategically, what are we enabling here? Well, you're actually creating stickiness and inertia around that core value proposition. You're creating experts and advocates and evangelists around that technology space. You're hardening it. You're capturing direct value to the complement, but that's indirect value back into your core value proposition enablers. This can even be possibly disruptive to competitors. So again, there's lots of strategic decision-making to happen here, and that requires strategic investment. When you start to step into this space, the true history of Kubernetes is a beautiful, beautiful story, but it's a highly competitive act of warfare from one company onto another. So it's possibly disruptive to competitors is always the fun there. And then lastly, if you try and publish the software that enables your core value proposition under an open source license, you need to really, really, really know what you're doing. And I chose those three company logos across the bottom because these are companies that are still struggling. These are companies that have had to relicense their software multiple times. I could add Elastic Inc. with Elasticsearch into that group. You need a certain level of expertise to even think about trying this. This is not a quick and dirty go-to-market strategy where you're going to magically convert your community into paying customers, because that doesn't work. And that doesn't work because at the end of the day, projects are not products. So projects are these interesting buckets of technology that you're developing collaboratively with like-minded engineers. Products solve customer problems and money's exchanged for perceived value. These things are almost contradictory in their definition if you put an OSI license on that project. The OSI license project says we're sharing this outbound with no expectation of return. A product says you need to pay me for value. These are contradictory terms. And then when you step up to that idea, like projects have communities. And there was this beautiful, beautiful quote from Martin Mikos when he was CEO of MySQL before Sun acquired them all those years ago. That projects have communities, and communities have time and no money. You can't sell something to the group of people that are happily using the software to solve their problems for themselves because they didn't have money to buy something in a lot of cases in the first place. Products have customers, and his aha moment was that customers have money and no time. There's a group of us have been jokingly calling this Mikos's law for a while now. And that kind of brings us up to, I'm just going to wrap up with a few minutes. There are reasons that I started to get involved with Saeed at Johns Hopkins to create Semesters of Code. At Microsoft, I worked for Microsoft from '99 to 2004. That was the height of the fun, angry period. We didn't say the L word out loud back then. And I had the fun position of being the Unix person at the Windows company who knew about open source when we didn't think open source was real. I came back to the company 4 years ago. And over this last 4 years, a lot of my job is helping correct situations that we've discovered where somebody has not been paying attention when they started using this idea of open source, whether they were doing open source creative work within their own product space, and so they've slapped an OSI license on it and are kind of publishing it out the door without understanding the implications, or more dangerous from a risk management perspective, folks that are pulling open source licensed buckets of technology into Azure without necessarily thinking through, again, the risks that need to be managed. And there's even the idea of improving research outcomes for all of the research that Microsoft does. So we started with this idea of semesters of code, and it's the class that I'm teaching right now. In fact, as soon as I finish up here, I have to go stand in the classroom, is a course on open source software engineering. And, I've been trying to, this is the first opportunity teaching undergrads about the difference between the computer science in the curriculum they're taking and software engineering. And the best way I try and explain it to them is this idea. I actually use an industrial metaphor because I had a friend who was a chemical engineer, and I said, so what does a chemical engineer do? And they said, well, after all those clever PhDs in the lab invent something, brand new compound, and it takes a liter of nitroglycerin to produce a gram of the new compound. It's my job to scale up the production of that so that we can produce metric tons of the new compound without blowing up the city. And that's the same kind of ideas that I'm trying to bring to the students of, this is about delivering not software in the small, but software at scale. And, I started them off, and I've been, winning friends along the way with some of the other university professors that I deal with as I walk them through this idea of, when you write a piece of software for yourself, you're solving an interesting problem for you. There's almost no engineering process required. If you share it with 10 friends, you start to have to think about how you share it. If you share it with 100 users, okay, they're probably not all your friends anymore. By the time you get to 1,000, if it's 1,000 users, 1,000 customers, or 1,000,000, keep walking your way up there. You need more and more engineering process to be able to deliver that software reliably and repeatably at scale. And that's scale for scale for the number of users, scale for the number of developers, scale for the complexity of the software. And so we've set out to build semesters of code with this idea of teaching undergraduates this way, because we want to, regardless of whether they choose a future in research or a future in IT or working for a vendor, we're trying to improve that both the software engineering skill set as well as the open source knowledge base. And that software engineering skill set, you used to get it on the job before this world was democratized and software was now something that anybody can be a programmer. And we're seeing we haven't lost the software engineering skills, but they're being diluted at an enormous rate. So we're trying to ensure that this experiment's been about seeing if we can actually teach this to undergraduates, improve research outcomes on the back end, improve the graduate skills, and actually improve the graduate hiring networks. Because what we've been doing, I'll skip past this in the nature of time. We tested this idea last January with an intersession course, and Claire has all the slides, so you can go back and read this, and I'm happy to answer questions. And we were doing things like introducing them to real software engineers as part of the course. But when we started off this fall with open source software engineering, this is semesters of code 1, it's a real undergraduate course at Johns Hopkins. We've been setting out to, part of the interesting part of this course and the interesting part of the experiment is I'm essentially running an interesting constrained version of the Google Summer of Code inside of a curriculum. So I need to bootstrap the students' skills rather quickly because we only have the semester. They've got about a third of the number of hours that they would have otherwise had as a summer project in Google Summer of Code. Matching students and projects is a bit of a challenge. So we are essentially matching students to student projects for the semester in active open source projects with mentors. And that also meant, there's a certain amount of training and mentoring of the mentors that's going on. So the back end of this has been fun. That's the word I'll use. Has been lots of fun. But I feel the experiment's going really well right now. For anybody that's listening that's academically minded or has an academic background. I'm now at the point towards the end of this first trial of the course where I know all of the things I have to do differently the next time we run the course. I have to tear it all apart and redo it. It's not like we've gone, oh, we have this great curriculum to teach now. No, I now know everything wrong with it, and I have to go back to the drawing board. But we're also talking about different futures, semesters of code 2 and 3 being this idea of independent study programs based on whether or not we can structure the student projects forward with either interesting readings or that they've already taken semesters of code 1. And we're also looking at kind of continuing education courses for the more business side of this. There are so many things that you want to teach people when they're in a software company or in IT in terms of how to think about these things, but they're very much more business centric and not really an undergraduate CS kind of thing. And with that, I am done.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you. Well, we've got only a minute and we've only got 2 very quick questions. So I am going to very quickly ask you a question. First one's from Johan. Is the course material for your semesters of code available?
I am happy to share it. I have done a very bad job of publishing it the way I published the intercession course. The intercession course is well published. There was the link to that, the January materials. I've done a bad job simply because I'm still creating on the fly. So I am happy to share it. Yes, I will be publishing it. And I am always happy to, take comments.
Brilliant, thank you. And I see Tony popping in here. Tony, I'll just, did you want to ask a question or no? Maybe he doesn't realize his camera's on.
Well, Heath's question is a good one, so let Heath go first.
Okay, so Heath's question is, basically you were talking about like managing risk and sharing risk and how the foundations can help do that. And I think that that's a really good pointer for people to say, if they're looking for things to use and collaborate in, doing so with projects that are in a foundation seems like a good path. So Heath's question is, in the case where governments are looking to shift big up applications that they've already built and maintained with large budgets and existing teams, and they may want to move that to open source. What is the role in foundations in that, specifically for governments, in terms of managing the shift and stewarding the projects? And are there specifically existing foundations equipped for that, specifically for government type projects?
I do not know of a nonprofit in the open source space in the G7 that is specifically created to do that kind of work. The managing risk and setting up that neutral ownership of assets gets interesting with governments, because the thing you're up against, and I've seen this specifically in a situation where state funds within the United States were used on a particular piece of software, and when they tried to license it as open source, they were having a hellish time building community, because state law said that assets built with state taxes could not be shared outside of the state boundary. And so you run into legal difficulties this way. And so, and this was forcing a set, and this was one of those beautiful situations. It was a perfect project because every state needed this software, and multiple states were getting into these bizarre bilateral sharing agreements to try and create that ability to share some of their changes. So there needs to be some thought put into this, but you run into other sets of problems that companies don't normally have when they're trying to share, or that individuals don't normally have when they're trying to share and just protect their own personal liability. So it's an excellent question, and it is absolutely a problem that needs some careful thought. I suspect there are ways to get around this to a certain extent by taking almost the don't ask, don't tell blind eye to it of no, we just published it under an open source license. The fact that other people have contributed to it, or maybe other people have used it, is irrelevant, because obviously we aren't sharing it outside of the tax base. But it's something that needs to be thought of very carefully, and people need to be very comfortable with that kind of language. So that's a really good question.
Okay, well, hopefully we might see some more movement in that space soon. And certainly, you know, there are an awful lot of projects out there that are sitting in foundations as well, I think, from a smart city perspective and other things we've seen as well, that at least there's a starting point for people, even if that kind of moving existing code into the open source foundations isn't necessarily there yet. But I see Johan, sorry.
It's a really tough problem, because you have to remember, all of this is based on copyright law. Copyright, and as you start to bubble this up, that means now the government is the one that sets that law. The government is the one that enables corporations to have a license to practice business. The government's the one that actually steps into this space of trying to correct for market failures with legislation. So all of these are kind of centralized in a government. So like, it's very easy to think about within a national boundary when a government has an opinion on things. The second you step across a nation state boundary, or as we discovered the hard way, a state boundary within the United States of America, you end up in these bizarre conversations that you need to start to think about, okay, so what does this mean at a cross-state transnational, you know, policy level? And so it's a different framing, and having a I'll firmly wear my vendor hat here, and having a vendor come along and say, you just have to do it this way is not going to help.
Yeah, well, luckily, luckily now that these conversations are coming up, because I think that question of policy, things are changing and moving. We know conversations are happening. So hopefully, if there's anything blocking things today, we're moving in a positive direction, and things will be better and more open in the future. And I will point to Johan's comment in the chat to say we should all look at OS2 in Denmark. So we will have a look at that too. But without further ado, oh, sorry, because
another really interesting example in that space. Andreason is a DSO doing green energy transmission work in Denmark. And so they are basically a government created monopoly. But again, they are starting to publish more and more of their software as open source projects. And we've had the pleasure and privilege of helping them do that, so that they're actually cleanly doing it in such a way that other countries, the equivalent of Andreason in other Nordic countries, are starting to step in and share and collaborate. So yeah, there's some really good
great new examples emerging. Well, with that,
thank you very much, people. Thank you for your time
so much. And I know you have to run to your class, but thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate it. And good luck with the semesters of code. More of it.
Thank you very much. Take care, folks.
Thanks,
Bye
Steve.
for now.
Bye-bye. And next I will start my video again, apologies for that. And I would love to invite to the stage Sherman from the UN Foundation, the Digital Impact Alliance. We would love to hear a little bit more from him, if he can join me from stage. Oh, here he is. Hi, Sherman. Lovely to see you. How are you doing? We heard earlier, Tony Shannon was talking to us about the GovStack initiative and how he's been looking at it and the benefits it could bring. So we're delighted that you could take the time today to join us to actually give us an overview of what's been happening in GovStack and how people can get involved. Thank you so much, and I'll let you take it away. You're on mute at the moment though, so I'll let you take yourself off mute. And I'll let you share your slides and off you go.
Yeah, let me pop that in. Can everybody see this?
We can. Thanks, Sherman.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, the Open Ireland Network and the Irish government as well, on inviting us on talking about the GovStack initiative, and give me specifically pleasure to see Tony again after a little Estonian island adventure. And also it's actually a pleasure also to follow another fellow Torontonian that's living abroad. I'm based in Europe, so maybe there's less of a set of challenges here, but apologies for the camera angle. I've been sitting in all-day meetings for the past 3 days in Geneva, so I'm standing up a little bit. So I want to talk about the GovStack initiative. I know that there's been some discussions around it, and there's some awareness being built now in a sense with Tony kind of advocating and championing a little bit. So giving you a sense of what the background is, but also how that really emulates the core values of the open source community as well. To clarify that GovStack itself is not about developing new open source products or advocating specifically for open source products, but there's a lot of kind of the operational environmental principles from the open source communities that we wanted to embed and draw upon into GovStack itself. So the kind of why, this is kind of the reality that we're facing today in the digital government's, scene in the development context, and probably also in developed economies. You may be familiar with how the picture looks in the earlier days when we start to procure and develop systems, and over time there are a lot of these, silo applications that put in place in the digital government landscape, and how do we kind of make sure that there's some harmonization and interoperations happening. And especially in the development context, it reflects the reality of how projects are being funded as well, because there are specific mandates coming from different development agencies and donors on how they structure funding around, how to facilitate digital development. So over time, you have on the ground realities where there are silo systems in place and different sectoral uses that don't connect and doesn't and it adds the barrier as countries are starting to think about a more holistic approach to digital government and the strategy planning behind it. There's all these kind of fragmentations that's happening on the ground that's kind of the problem now. So in a sense, I talked about the lack of interoperability right now on existing applications that's in place, and the kind of delineations happening in the donor investment side of things, that leads into inefficiency, right? In terms of coordination and planning and the deployment of new services, digital services in particular. And so what we have been trying to think about and conceptualizing is what kind of mental exercise that some of the more advanced digital government states has been going through, and have and thinking about first the cross-sectoral common building block, what we call elements that are in place, through synthesizing use cases that might be cutting across different sectors. So what are the common business processes that are general enough that that serves multiple purposes across sector? So you might have a patient that's trying to register to visit a clinic that uses the same kind of ID authentication process that a student might be using in registering for enrollment into the education system. So over time, in more advanced states, they start to realize that there are these underlying components that can be managed and shared and distributed across the digital government environment, so that new services can be built on top in a more agile way, in a more coordinated way, and it prevents further fragmentations into having verticalized systems in place. So this is the initial framework that we at Digital Impact Alliance at the UN Foundation had done with ITU to start to synthesize that and start to build a story around what are these general components that should be in place. And so this leads to something that we observe that's already in place in countries like Estonia, like in India, like in Singapore, where they have these kinds of general components set up, and then services are very rapidly and very easily and more coordinated way built on top of it. And you might have seen literatures where you have different flavoring of the layers, but the underlying concept is the same. That they did that a mental exercise, and they went through what are the building blocks that needs to be in place that can serve multiple purposes, such as digital ID, digital signature, registrations, and so on, that then formulate the foundational layer of their digital government environment, and then more specific applications being built on top of it to serve a patient, and a farmer, a student, and so on and so forth. And as I alluded to before, some examples like in Estonia, in India as well, they actually took a lot. We took actually a lot of the lessons learned from India in terms of how they structure these different generic components into our initial framework. And Singapore as well, having this kind of also government as a platform or government as a stack model in terms of modeling the digital government transformation. And some of the value propositions we're starting to see in literature, and we're trying to prove out now in the process of establishing the GovTech initiative, is around cost efficiency. How does it actually translate the harmonization and the building of these generic components to facilitate multiple processes? How does that actually facilitate real economic returns? And we've seen some in the literature, and it adds to greatly the argument of how other countries are interested in following this pathway. And it also makes service delivery more agile, because you don't have to rebuild the underlying elements that needs to facilitate these general business processes that can be repeated. And speed, of course, and minimization of vendor lock-in. It's an example, I guess, on that you can draw that from the open source product community side on how to modularize different software elements so that there is kind of pick and choose and a more distributed way of looking at software applications. In a way, it's emulating in this traditional back in the IT industry, this whole enterprise architectural argument, and now it's more like microservice or microservice domain-driven architecture, but essentially it's the same story. It's how do we make these kind of reusable blocks much more accessible to countries. And some evidence that I've alluded to before around cost saving, around real economic return, because if there is fundamental elements that are in place from the digital government point of view, it's not only that they can facilitate better service delivery and administration within the government itself, but it also opens up a gateway for industries to participate and build new services and commercial activities on top of it as well. And that's something that that you can see as an example in India. So what we're trying to do now, this is actually like this was the 3-day exercise that we went through just the past 3 days. So this is really new in terms of our vision, mission, and value proposition. So actually, thank you to the Irish audience being the test users of this. What we're thinking is looking at these advanced countries examples and knowing that there is the possibility of understanding what these generic components are. We wanted to really inform what the specifications and the design are of these core building block elements. So GovTech is an extension of the concept that I described earlier, but it really goes into now an approach of elaborating on these technical design of building blocks around ID, around registrations, and so on. And I can show you what these building blocks are right now. In the initial framework, we kind of identify a set of 23, but these are not set in stone. But and also, over time as they evolve, as the thinking around these building blocks evolve, they might get split or they might get combined. But it's an initial phase. These are the generic components that we have identified that facilitate core general processes within government administrations and digital services. And there's some minimal characteristics that we are able to identify, so they must be reusable, that they are not really sectoral or context driven. They can be open source, or they can be proprietary and or in any other form of licensing. and they have to facilitate and multiple, use cases and applications. And the real kind of characteristic to point out is the interoperability aspect of this. That cuts down the siloing effect of original monolithic systems, and move that towards recognizing how these generic components are supposed to interconnect and serve business processes. So they are kind of three-pronged approach to the strategy, but to the initiative right now. As I mentioned, that these are there's initial kind of framing of what these building blocks are before the initiative. So now what we're trying to do is formulating kind of these building block domain expert-driven groups to really go into the specification aspects of the building block. So really dig into how ID is supposed to be designed, what are these API specifications, and what are the processes and the interoperability and security aspects of these individual blocks themselves. And that hopefully will translate into references that will evolve over time, obviously, but it accelerates countries in development setting to not have to repeat that when they want to try to understand now the same kind of generic components that should be in place as they transform in the initial messy model into a more coordinated approach. And obviously we want to do that as well through demonstrations. So not only having the reference specifications published on GitHub or what have you, but actually working to synthesize that and demonstrate that and in kind of a test bed or sandbox environment, so that we actually pull in some products that emulate these building blocks through the evaluation assessment of these specifications, and put them together in an interoperable way to demonstrate some of the example use cases that we have identified. Because in that way, you can actually help countries realize and visualize how these products that traditionally they might have thought that it's not interoperable, how do we move them towards interoperability, and then some kind of application as well. Because in the partnership with the founding partners of the initiative, we have our different country engagements that are ongoing right now, and we all understand that this has really core values in terms of output into what they're doing in informing digital government strategies in the country setting in a bilateral sense. So right now, these are the waves of building blocks we have identified and we're being worked on. So starting with registrations and information mediation, identifications and authentication, like really core foundational elements. And then moving into wave 2 consents management and workflows and algorithms and so on. And again, these have specific groups behind them that are working on pulling together the specification. So in a sense, it's not completely open source, community driven kind of model, but it is moving towards in that direction. And we've been at it for around a year. And as we are thinking about 2022, this is kind of the initial output picture, I would say, but it's not long-term vision, so to speak. So we want to make sure that the specifications are sound. It's checked. It's verified by external panel review processes, and it has an underlying component on how do we interoperate them with documentations around the architectural elements of that as well, and the open APIs that needs to fit on top of each of them. And moving into the demonstrational phase, as I mentioned before, also pulling together a sandbox environment or test bed where we can demonstrate this initial sets of use cases that we've identified in green, just to make sure that we are testing the interoperability aspect of it, that it actually serves multiple use case, and it kind of confirmed the characteristics of the building block concept that really grounded this work. And over time, what we want to do is obviously accelerate the learning. We want to make sure that the countries have the capacity to adopt an approach like this and inform how, as they think about digital government strategy or in the roadmap of implementations, how do they adopt this kind of building block approach. We want to make sure that the building block specifications continue to evolve, and there are more use cases that enrich the requirements that would stress test these specifications, so that the specifications will also get strengthened over time as well. Because if you have more use cases coming from different sectors or different development programs, and they kind of we kind of bring those requirements in and make sure that the products that we identify that serve as building blocks and through the specification process can really facilitate all the requirements that are coming in from the countries that we're engaging. That builds a very powerful sets of references, and it also makes a much stronger argument over time that these building blocks really does serve in a multi-sectoral way. And there's also sustainability element of this, because we're just in initial phase, so we need to make sure that there's kind of longer runway over time and engagement to the larger ecosystem as well, because there are different kind of groups in this space investing in digital products. So we want to make sure that we make sense of how they interoperate with one another, or the different products that are being invested interoperate with one another, and this harmonization aspect of the investment itself. So this is where I see a lot of parallelism to the open source community space, and this is really just something that literally just came out of the oven, if you will, yesterday, on how to move that from a working group for more like closed door model into an open source community model. So right now we have the coordination aspect with the project management teams that is cross-cutting across the different partners. We have some working groups within that's being managed by us right now that work on these different specifications. But over time, we want to make sure that we translate or there's a transition into a more open source community model, that we engage different domain space within the open source community around ID, again, around payments and security and so on. So there is a larger pool of experts behind informing these specifications and addressing the requirements that would come in from the product side, from the country engagement side. As we reach out to more countries and understanding what their requirements and the use cases are, bring them back, generalizing them, and then synthesizing it and compartmentalizing it into the different specifications. So there's kind of this continued feedback that should happen in evolving the specifications itself. And this is also kind of an initial picture that we're thinking on how to build this whole environment up. So hosting the specification itself, but also demonstrating different code base or products that could facilitate the demonstration of these use cases and build this kind of marketplace product culmination aspect around it. Because if it only sits as a reference, we're not really connecting to all the different digital products that are already being invested out there, whether it's open source or not. And we want to make sure that we're not duplicating the kind of efforts that's in place on investing in new products. We want to make sure that what we're doing is really only looking at interoperability of the products themselves. and I'll just skip it because this is kind of just solving what the problems is in the beginning that I've described. I think I'll skip to this just to highlight some of the ways that we're thinking around how others can engage. So there are some governance elements that I've illustrated before that we're trying to formulate now, and we're trying to identify what is the right partners to come in and what's the right terms and references. We want to make sure that there's a sustainable pipeline of new use cases. But I think the most relevant one to the open source community is around how do we engage the existing domain expertise that are already out there to inform the evolution of the specifications, but also proposing products and proposing solutions that emulate this kind of building block characteristics. And there are some, strategic partners involved right now. For example, with the partnership with the German Development Corporation and Estonia being recognized in the international development space as a leading example in digital government, as well as within working groups themselves. There are colleagues from, for example, World Bank or UNCTAD or OSIA and other development agencies that are more looking at specific building blocks themselves, and the application and the country engagement aspect of it through Smart Africa and through our own partner network into countries. And I think that summarizes the initiative and my effort in giving it a background. If there's any question now or comments, welcome to receive them.
Thank you so much, Sherman. Thank you for sharing that with us. We really appreciate getting that overview. I have a quick question, and again, I'd invite anyone on the call, if they want to put in a question, maybe even put it in the chat. It's a little easier to see it, so we'd appreciate it there. But in the meantime, I have a quick question, and it's based on one of the themes that came up earlier. So one of the things that folks were talking about earlier was about managing risk, and how, for example, sometimes with these shared collaborative projects, shared risk is actually a benefit. And I noted that it wasn't necessarily one of the benefits that you mentioned on your slide. So I'm just curious to see, from your engagements with the candidate countries that are collaborating here, has there been any discussion about risk? Has there been a conversation about how they're supported through this journey, and how do they manage that?
I think it's still where our engagement activities with countries are quite early, just because we don't have the specifications yet ready, but we are kind of priming them in a way, because there are countries that lack the capacity or need some kind of assistance on how to think about enterprise architecture, how to think about the digital government strategy in a more national coordinated sense. So in the context of doing that kind of mental exercise work, we want to factor in things about cybersecurity issues, or things around responsible data use, and or making sure that whichever countries we're supporting, that they're not going to use whatever we're trying to supply in a harmful way. So there are some elements of risk management in the process, in the early effort of informing or providing assistance to country. And then once the practical technical outputs of the GovSec initiative came to light, then it will probably fit into the phase where they're thinking around implementation aspect of it now, and how do they then either develop it or procure these different generic components into forming the digital government systems.
And in terms of, you mentioned as well, which I thought was great, the idea that in certain areas and in certain countries, you're seeing an emergent ecosystem, a kind of a support ecosystem where people are providing services around the GovStack components. Are some of those companies within those countries, are they also providing that kind of support as a service? And are any of them thinking about bringing that global, or are they just doing it locally?
So how we're engaging right now, expertise within working groups, they're working on, we we are engaging them in an individual level. So we make sure that there is no kind of conflict of commercial interest per se, but there are, you know, they do come from a lot of great open source examples and solutions that's been applied in you know, in some of the countries that we highlighted. For example, an important partner of us, Estonia, you know, they practically have done this kind of work, and they have engaged with a lot of product companies that have expertise that are being sourced on an individual level to inform the specification work that we're doing now. And we also are in talks with India and Singapore, where they also have done this kind of specification and development work. India, for example, they have, you know, great kind of general systems around ID, around payment. So we want to make sure we bring those expertise in as well.
Okay, thank you. And because there may be some folks in the virtual room today, but they may be interested in thinking about potentially providing some services around GovStack or anything like that. So if there's an organization out there who's interested in getting involved, perhaps not from a country perspective, but from that commercial ecosystem perspective, how can they get involved, and perhaps what resources might be available for them?
That's great. I mean, definitely reach out to me on an individual level or through the general channel that I put on the screen here. This is something that we want to make sure that we build this kind of pipeline of interest as we transition from this, you know, contract-based working group model into open source community model, right? Is to be able to make sure that we engage with the right domains in the open source space around people that have experience doing ID work, people that have experience doing payment work. So once that kind of governance thinking and the kind of, you know, open source community-based driven evolution of the specification work is in place, and we have formalized that with the across the core partners, we will definitely open that up in terms of invitations and in terms of how people can then come in and review the specifications, critique it, improve it, and address new requirements that will come in from a country point of view.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Sherman, for joining us today. I know this is in the middle of your meeting in Geneva, so we really appreciate getting all this information hot off the press, and we also really appreciate you stepping away from your meeting to share it with us. So thank you again for joining us today, and we hope that we will hear more about GovStack in Ireland in the future. Maybe we'll be on one of the future slides. It'd be great to see.
Yes, definitely. Thanks
a million. Thank you, Sherman.
Yes.
And next, I am going to invite to the stage Saeed Chowdhury and Denise Cooper. Now, I've been working with both in the context of the OSPO++ network for the last 18 months or so, which is a community and a network of open source program offices in public sector and universities and governments. And through that work, we have learned a lot about the brilliant example that has been put in place, a great international collaboration between the City of Paris and Johns Hopkins University and the St. Francis Neighborhood Centre. And I've invited them both here today, and hopefully Denise will be joining us shortly. I know she's in transit, and I can hear.
No, I'm here, but you have to make it possible for me to turn on my video. It says you have stopped me.
Oh, well, hopefully someone will shortly be able to. Yes, there's a Denise Cooper here that's a co-host, but perhaps there might be another Denise Cooper. Oh, here we are. There we go. Yay, great, fantastic. So we have everyone on screen. So as I was just saying, thank you both for joining us here today. And I was hoping that you would be able to take this conversation and maybe share a little bit for this audience, a little bit about the collaboration, that international collaboration that happened in the context of Lutece, the project Lutece, because I think it's a fantastic example of how international collaboration can be taken from almost like a government level or a public sector, civic organization level, right down to impact on the ground. And I'm hoping you can explore that and maybe give some tips and tricks to folks in Ireland about how they could achieve something similar. So I'll leave you both to have that conversation. And if anyone has any questions, put them in the chat window. We'll be able to come back to Denise and Saeed at the end. Thank you both.
Hey, Saeed, how you doing?
Denise, how are you?
I'm good. I'm just settled finally here. I came home to my housemate has COVID, so I can't actually go to my house.
Oh no.
So yeah,
So
it's been a little
sorry to hear
hectic. He's going to be fine. He's made out of rubber, but I'm not. So anyway, here we are, having just seen each other in Paris just like days
Yes.
ago. And she would like to hear us talk about the amazing Lutece situation. So I'll tell you what, I'll do the setup part, and then you can talk about how you guys ended up implementing. Okay.
That'd be great. Yep. Thanks.
Great. So Baltimore, Maryland is a city that has been in the crosshairs for a while now. There's a lot of crime there. There's a lot of people of color who don't have a lot of trust of the police department. Lots of civic services have fallen down. They actually were hacked last year and didn't have email for about 6 months. And this is the city offices I'm talking about. So some of the people that live in and work in Baltimore got interested in trying to be part of the solution. So this is a grassroots, homegrown citizen effort to try to help fix their town. And a guy named Jacob Green came and found me at a famous open source conference and said, you know, could I hang around with you and learn all about open source? Because I think that there's a way that open source can help Baltimore. And so we spent quite a bit of time, you know, knocking around. One of the places we went was the city of Paris, because in his travels poking around, he had discovered that there was a piece of software sitting in Paris that's what they use to run that big city, 217 separate distinct services that were open sourced. And so somebody should be able to pick up that code and make productive use of it in a place like Baltimore. And he got interested in that idea. He had me come to talk to the people and see how committed they were to open source, because they didn't have very much community that they'd built. Excuse me. There we go. And so we did that. We had some conversations. And then around the same time, Jacob was talking to you at Johns Hopkins, because Johns Hopkins is a major employer in the city of Baltimore. And I believe he's even an alumni of that university. And he was thinking that if the city institutions are not showing up, maybe this large employer would be interested in getting involved in the solution space. Now, Saeed, what did you first hear from Jacob? What was your first pitch he gave you?
Yeah, Jacob had a large, interesting set of vision around open source and universities. So in essence, a key question was, in many ways, a lot of open source software development started in universities, yet if you look at the last 20 years or so, it's mainly the private sector. One could argue it's mainly the private sector that's taken much more of a leadership role in terms of moving it forward. You know, Stephen's talked about the engineering practices, the canonical sets of licenses, and so on. So his overarching question was, where are universities, at least in the US, in terms of open source? And how can universities engage more effectively around open source to meet some of their goals, some of their policy interests, and so on? So we talked about this idea of using Lutece. As you mentioned, Paris has invested, I think, nearly 20 years at this point of effort, and many euros toward this municipal services platform. It's aimed at the city of Paris, so there are some interesting questions about how Lutece evolves with other cities, and maybe in the context of GovStack, for example. But it's a platform that's being used every day by the citizens of Paris to support their needs. So one other point that is important about Hopkins is we are the largest recipient of external funding in the United States for universities, over $3 billion a year. And while we're the largest in that sense, depending on who you ask, universities in the US receive over $150 billion of external funding. And one of the biggest questions that's coming up, even within Hopkins, is how do we have more direct social impact from that funding? So we do things, we publish articles, we share data sets, but how do we have more direct impact in everyday lives of the citizens in our cities and in our states and so on? So this idea of a municipal services platform that's open source be used to help the citizens of Paris that maybe can have more direct impact in the city of Baltimore just seemed like a wonderful opportunity. And as you described, the city of Baltimore is dealing with many, many issues. There are, unfortunately, some trust questions that have come up recently, but the community centers in Baltimore have a much stronger, deeper, even longer relationship with the citizens of Baltimore. So the question that came up for us was, could we take Lutece somehow and work with it in the context of Baltimore, working through these community centers? And the St. Francis Neighborhood Center in West Baltimore came forward and said, we would love to be involved in this kind of work. Jacob was instrumental in that as well. And I'm glad to say that we are now piloting Lutece in the St. Francis Neighborhood Center. A couple of really important points is we launched the first university-based open source programs office at Hopkins for this and other purposes, but specifically to work with Lutece and the St. Francis Community Center. And the OSPO was the coordinating entity that made it happen. Now, I will just point out, universities typically cooperate with other universities or other entities through grants or MOUs or data use agreements or things of that nature.
Lawyers are involved.
Lawyers are involved. You can imagine lawyers from Paris, from Hopkins, and from St. Francis and getting together and trying to work out an agreement to work on anything, much less a software platform. So the beauty of this is what I argued successfully is Lutece has a license. It's an open source license. It's a very permissive one. It's BSD. That's a legal framework, right? Lawyers did get together and write a license that this platform is working under. That can be the framework under which we can collaborate. So instead of spending a lot of time worrying about the legal agreements and so on, we went right to working on the code together. Right. And went very, very quickly towards St. Francis, what do you need in order for this to work? Paris, how do we make that happen? So building up the community of users, building up the community of developers, and doing that in a much more seamless, much less frictionless way. And we're seeing very interesting parallels between the needs of a local community center in Baltimore and the city of Paris. So I'm hoping this is the beginning of the journey.
Well, what's interesting to me about this experiment is that it's a public-private partnership that the actual municipal government is sort of only in an ancillary way involved in. Like they're aware of it, but they're pretty much just watching to see what happens. And it helped you, open source helped you get around the, I'm going to put words in your mouth here, the excessive formalism around normal collaborations in a major university like yours.
Yeah, so, there's no question. That's true.
Yeah. So that turns out to be one of the main reasons that people go out and use open source. I've been involved in open source basically since the term was coined, and I've talked to a lot of companies, large and small, and helped them get an open source implementation together. And you know, the most often it's actually streamlines things for people. Because the imperative to be transparent does away with a lot of weird, unnecessary cycles of internal checks and balance, right? And when I say unnecessary, there's somebody who thinks they're necessary, but these things tend to accrete and they get in the way of progress pretty majorly. So since Claire set this up to be also what would you do for Ireland, around the same time that Jacob came to you and started talking about setting up an OSPO in the library, we started hearing from Lero here in Ireland. Lero is the software research center run out of University of Limerick, but there are Lero people in all the major universities, and you know they conduct research about software, what works, what doesn't, those kinds of things. And they had an annual review by their funder, SFI, who dinged them on only one thing that they weren't doing, which was open source. And so we had said to them, you know, we're starting to see universities starting OSPOs as a forcing function or a focal point for the questions that they're getting about open source involvement. And Lero very quickly said, oh, we should do that because SFI was unhappy with them. But they didn't really have a plan or outcomes they were looking for other than to be able to say that they had created the thing. So I noticed that isn't going very well yet. Now we've had inquiries from individual universities in Ireland who want to hear more about what you did and what some of our other friends at OSPO++ have done, because they're starting to look at that. And to give you an example, I'm not going to say which university, but there's a student, a grad student somewhere in Ireland, who did some work at MIT as an undergrad and open sourced his work, and then did some more work at CMU for a master's and open sourced that work. And now he's ready to finalize his PhD, and his plan is to open source that work as well. But he's getting a cease and desist order from MIT on the grounds that he's violating a patent they filed on his work.
Yeah,
which,
that's,
you know,
unfortunate to hear. Yeah.
So let's talk for a minute about tech transfer. So for those of you listening in that don't know much about how universities work, tech transfer or translation are two terms to describe figuring out how to get the technology that's created inside of an organization used on the outside. Usually, you know, to redound to the greater glory of the institution somehow. And there's a couple schools of thought on this. There's a school that thinks patents is the way to go, and there's a school that thinks open source is the way to go. And both exist in Ireland. There's a very early open source tech transfer office in Trinity. John Whelan has done some amazing work there, looking at, you know, so it's kind of a, what do you care about? Do you care more about having impact in your community, or do you care more about capturing dollars for your university, right? Those seem to be the two wheels we're turning. But you're trying for a third thing, which is, let's start doing good work and see if we can get grants for it. And that's starting to work for you, right?
It is. So as an example, the work around Blue Test that I just described is a core component of a grant we've received from the Mellon Foundation. So in some sense, the sequencing is backwards, quote unquote, backwards from the university perspective. We didn't go after a grant first and then figure out how to cooperate and build something. We went out, cooperated, built something, and went to a granting agency and said, isn't this interesting work? Don't you think this should be supported in some way? And they said, yes. So I'm not in any way saying that the typical ways in which universities work, you know, sort of the traditional ways that we work are not valid or important. I'm just saying that layering in this new way of thinking about how we might work, open source is a verb rather than a noun. That's something I've heard you and Jacob and Claire and others say, is entirely consistent with the way universities like to do things. But by starting with that premise, we open up much more opportunity space. And tech transfer is a key part of this. And I will say that, you know, I engaged the tech transfer, you know, department at Hopkins very early in this process. And, you know, I'm just being candid in saying that the first response was one of curiosity and maybe even a little bit of anxiety around what's happening here. And I think where we are today in a relatively short time is that tech transfer now understands this is an additional pathway for translation. It's not trying to restrict what they would normally do. It actually adds another option. It's something the faculty are asking for directly. It's something our funding agencies are asking for directly. So it's in the best interest for a technology transfer group to be prepared to respond to something like this. And one really important distinction that Justin Colomino from Microsoft and GitHub gave a talk to OSPO++ about licenses and legal issues and Microsoft's journey. He made this really important distinction between the project and the product. You know, Stephen made the same point earlier, right? Is that we don't have to figure out all of the product type implications from day one.
That's right.
And when you're in the early phases of the research and the grant activities, it may be okay not to figure all that out. But it's also important to know that whatever choices we make early have downstream effects. So I think what technology transfer at Hopkins is now looking at is the role of being, you know, a consultation early in the projects and saying, if you make these choices, this is what you may be, you know, restricting or inhibiting further down the line. Or if you make those choices, you open up all those possibilities if we start to think about these as products and so on. So it's just becoming a much deeper and more nuanced conversation.
Yeah,
which I think is
I
key.
will say that the legal expertise that Stephen was alluding to in his talk and the difficulty of getting it wrong, not actually creating enough room for the market that or the opportunity that you need to embody in terms of profit is a real problem.
Sure.
There's only a handful of people that know enough to help an organization work through that, and it's not an easy thing to commoditize. You know, we don't have a simple flow chart to help you figure out what license you want and why.
Right.
There have been several attempts in the last 22 years to make one, but it's not an easy topic. When I was listening to Stephen talk, it's always great to hear him talk, of course, but I was really sorry that he didn't spend more time talking about what semesters of code actually is. And
Sure.
I thought we should spend a little time on that because I think it's a clever hack and it's an example.
Yep.
I'm a big advocate. We didn't say this at the top of the hour, but I actually arguably created the first open source program office in the world. And I'm back when I was a son, so a long time ago now. And I am a big fan of open source program offices do create that beacon, that place of focus where
Yep.
people can come to get their issues handled and where they can go to learn about open source, because in theory, at least the people in the OSPO are experts or have access to experts. But then after that, and after compliance is kind of managed, there isn't much for the OSPO to do except maybe figure out how to be additively wonderful to the open source movement in the large. And one of the first companies that did that was Google. Google was not going to give away its code because they had made proprietary modifications to the Linux kernel to allow their search engine to be more effective. That was a trade secret. They were not going to give that code away, and they weren't required to because they were running SaaS, right? But they knew that they were going to run into problems with the open source community if they didn't give back commensurate with the value they were deriving. And so they came up with this clever hack called Summer of Code. And what Summer of Code did was it paid real money to college students who succeeded, and there was a lengthy process of winnowing, who succeeded in getting accepted for a Summer of Code internship. And then they were matched with a mentor from the project that they were going to be touching so that their contributions would be guaranteed to find a way into these public projects. But Summer of Code, for all that it's wonderful and a very clever hack, is still a lot of work for those projects to engage with. And at some point, the public open source community has gotten tired of dealing with an influx of new students every quarter that just need to make a check-in so they get their grade and aren't really invested in the project. So Stephen came up with a very clever hack. Do you want to describe how it's run at Johns Hopkins?
Yeah, sure. And you're right. I wish Stephen had said more because he describes it very eloquently. I'll do my best.
He does.
So this very much resonates with, I think of three pillars of the university: research, education, translation. We've talked a little bit about translation and a little bit about research. This is very much coming on the education side of things. And Stephen talked about the interest that Microsoft has, in terms of supporting his work with this. My understanding is it relates to what we were talking about, is raising the awareness, capacity, and competency earlier in the software development process, the open source process, so that it's easier for companies like Microsoft to engage with the university. He's talked about cases where Microsoft researchers come to him and said, "This is a great thing, we should put it into our products." And he said that it takes 2 years to sort of untangle all the messes that happen because there were just not good engineering practices or poor license choices and so on. So this is very much aligns well with the curricular goals of the Department of Computer Science at Hopkins, which is we do want, that slide he had of, sort of creating the reagent and then chemical engineering, making it industrial. We do still want to teach foundational computer science skills, and there are very good reasons for doing so. But we want the students to also understand, if you ever need to take this outside of the context of your personal laptop, for example, and he has that great phrase, "It worked on my laptop," right? If you want to get beyond that, then you need to understand software engineering from an industrial sense, and open source is a great way to do that. And so he is, leveraging or building or borrowing that model of the mentorship model of Summer of Code. And the way the course is set up is there are multiple projects. Lutece is one of them, one from my group called the Public Access Submission Systems, another. We have some from Microsoft. We also have one that is a U.S. National Institute of Health funded health science project. So taking real open source projects, getting mentors from those projects, working directly with the students. So in parallel to getting the course and the background and the context and the understanding of software engineering from all those dimensions, legal, economic, community, culture, diversity, they are in parallel working on code. They're actually working on these projects. They're actually working with team members of those projects as mentors.
And they're working on projects that have pre-selected to be available to this crop of students in this way. So it's not just I'm knocking at your door hoping that you'll answer. There's already been an introduction there.
That's correct. And I'm on the Slack channel where the students and mentors are chatting, and it's great to see students just asking questions. And one of the mentors jumps in and says, sure, you try this, or did you look at this, or try that differently. And they're getting a feel for what it actually means to do software development in the real world earlier in their career than would otherwise be possible.
Well, and they're learning and they're learning collaborative development, which is not taught typically in CS. Sometimes you get a single professor who will do it for one class, but it's not yet taught as a normal thing. We'll get back to that in a second.
Yeah, and the other thing is that I've heard, to your point, that students graduate and employers will say, they interview and they say, here's the best code you've ever seen, 3 months into their job, and the response is, we hired about 1,000 of you who wrote the best code we've ever seen. We need you to learn to work together and not try to compete with each other. This is not school anymore. This is a whole different environment. So that's very much a key part of that. And I will also add that for the projects, we made it very clear this is an educational experience. We don't want to put too much pressure on the students to say, oh, you better commit code, or somehow you didn't meet your goals. But the projects themselves are getting better prepared for onboarding people, right?
That's right.
The project that I lead, I'm seeing now how much better we will be the next group of students that come in, or the next developers we don't know. To Stephen's point, people you don't know start making contributions. We are getting that as a benefit. The projects are getting better in preparing for that.
So another one of the things I'd like to see happen in Ireland, and that I've committed to helping with as much as I'm allowed, is experimentation with the actual curriculum that's taught in CS programs to teach these collaborative methods. Because at least in Ireland, the tech economy is a little bit different. And there's a little bit of indigenous tech, but mostly what there is hospitality for existing companies that need a European office. And the quid pro quo there is you're going to hire Irish people, and we're well educated and we speak English, and willing workforce, right? But that we're not teaching those collaborative development methods in school. And we are sometimes expecting people to figure that out in real time when they don't have peers who know how to do it either, right? And yet there's good evidence that suggests that this is the way going forward that software will be developed. So I think it's pretty important to get out in front of the idea of how can we teach this effectively. And I think the semesters of code is inevitably going to be part of that setup.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. There's an equivalent, if you will. I was talking about the way research typically happens in universities and how open source license is made, this collaborative development around, a municipal services platform like Utest that can become a research platform for a place like Hopkins. That equivalent exists with semesters of code and the educational work, right? It's very difficult to imagine students at another university working on a course at Johns Hopkins. Just the accreditation, the administrative hoops, trying to transfer credits, those are very complex problems. But you can imagine students at different universities, it doesn't have to be just in the US, right? It can be in Ireland, working on a common code base, right? So the credit they receive or the course they're taking is local, but the platform is global. So it's a wonderful way of connecting education opportunities in different places without, again, having to try and sign administrative handshakes or sort of legal agreement.
Let me say one more thing about Foundation, since I typed into somebody else's chat during the earlier part of this program. The problem with where you house your government funded or university funded open source project is a real thing. There's lots of different existing foundations that are vying for your energy and in some case your money, depending on which one you pick. But there are also lots of, I mean, I've seen a lot of poor choices made. Lutece, as an example, was open sourced almost 12 years before we got involved with it and had got almost no uptake in that 12 years, even though the code was published. And the reasons why that happened are really interesting. One is they were using body shops to do most of their development, and body shops are not incented to figure out how to build collaborative code. They're incented to convince you that they're writing it from scratch for you every time, because then they can charge you for that, right? And they don't know how to build community, and they don't know, and it's not written into their contracts, to be fair to them, to service that. So that was one of the problems that Lutece had. But another one of the problems Lutece had was the foundation that they chose to host in had no idea how to help them build a community.
Right.
And so making that choice is not an easy thing, but it is something that as we take this work into academia and municipal government, there are going to be lots of opportunities to fill gaps that are universal gaps. So it would not be impossible for Ireland to raise a suitable vehicle for Europe to host its projects in a kind of neutral environment, right? That was thought out, and that there were people around to actually make them successful endeavors. That would be possible to do, and might become very sticky for the open source in Europe community. I can see that being an interesting idea. And if somebody here wants to talk more about that, I would love to do that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, Denise. And I think the only thing I'll fold into that, which is the culture, the mission, the sense of community is very different in a university and a municipality than it is in a private sector company. So we need to account for that in whatever kind of entity that does that kind of work you just described.
But the other thing is, there are increasingly corporate projects to give people time to do fun engineering, if you will. They call it social coding for good most often. There's 2 or 3 registries where you can say, I've got a small coding project. I just need somebody to help.
That's right.
And and then on the corporate end, you've got somebody who's just been working on a project for 2 years and has shipped it and is taking a break and would like to do something philanthropic. So that's another thing that is happening in the States, but not so much here in Europe.
Yeah, and as you know, we're floating, if you will, this idea of an Institute of Applied Open Source as maybe one way that this kind of thing can happen. I've worked on large multi-university grants, and in fact, I was the principal investigator of one that was a $10 million award, and I spent an enormous amount of time doing nothing but coordinating the grant and working with other institutions and so on. And the good thing is that open source software has patterns in place for how this happens. But if you got, for example, we've got multiple universities involved trying to work together, it would be really handy to have a third neutral entity that can play that coordinating role.
Wouldn't it,
and in essence, not have it all fall on one individual at one university, which also tilts sort of the perceptions of ownership and the role of each of the tech transfer offices.
Right. Yeah. So we have an insider question towards the end, because we're coming to the end of our time, you and I. There's some interest in hearing about the future of health research at Johns Hopkins and whether more open source is going to make its way into that movie.
Yeah, so I put a link into the chat for something that's relevant in this regard. I've been working with a researcher named Paul Nagy in our School of Medicine. He's involved in this effort that's called Odyssey. And what's interesting is Paul has really embraced this idea of a different way of working. And what the medical community has actually done a very good job of coming up with standards for describing medical data. But there's still lots of restrictions. Why? Obviously, patient data, clinical data, and so on. Paul is part of this effort that basically said, instead of trying to make these data use agreements, which are typically pairwise, and then become impossible when a third institution gets involved, or you sign the agreement and then suddenly realize that's not actually how the data are being used. This group has gone off and written a set of common open source tools that basically allow you to infer what others' data are or what they're doing with them or how they're processing them. And they're finding that that's a much more frictionless, better way to actually learn about each other's data and then ultimately share them. So what you're starting to see is open source as a verb, as a way of getting to understand each other's data without that legal kind of entanglement up front. But
Right.
they've now reached a point where they need help with sustainability and coordination. I talked to one of the principals for this at Columbia, and he said, look, I never wanted to be an open source community manager. I never wanted to learn about open source licenses and so on. It's been fantastic what we've been able to do, but we need help. We need someone to come along and say, this is how you do things in an open source way. This is how you sustain it, and so on. So I think this is the beginning of a very robust movement in health sciences around
That's
open source.
excellent news, and that's a really important market for Ireland. I will say, in the context of open source as a verb, part of what we're saying there is don't spend too much time working at creating infrastructure and rules and stuff because you're afraid of open source. Just do small projects first so that you can learn fast what you need to care about, and then figuring out how to set up that. Sadly and unfortunately, after 20 years, it is a vanishingly rare skill to know how to do all these things, how to choose a license, how to set up a community, how to all the things we've been talking about require expertise. And another thing that Ireland could really do that would be huge, because we know Irish people are very good at being program managers, project managers, because they're good at conciliating and getting two parties to meet together. That if we started teaching people in Ireland how to do these things, I think it could become a specialty. And certainly if we set something up that would support governments, then they would have to learn it. And I think it's worth doing because nobody is figuring out how to teach that right now.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, I think Claire's about to jump back in. Thank you, Saeed.
No, thank you.
Hello, and thank you both for that amazing discussion. To hear more about what was happening at Johns Hopkins University and with Lutece was marvelous, and I really appreciate how you've been outlining some of the opportunities for Ireland that are not just local in terms of our work with open source and government, but actually could be regional or even global. So thanks, Denise, for those ideas. I think they're fantastic. And again, even looking in the chat, seeing what's happening with Semesters of Code, having heard about that from Steve earlier, maybe we can look for some opportunities to have Irish students collaborate with that great initiative too. That would be amazing in the future. So thank you both for that. So we are coming to the end of our event today, and I would just like to finish up by saying a huge thank you to everyone who participated today, to all our speakers, and to all the folks that helped behind the scenes. So Open Ireland Network is being supported by the Technology Ireland ICT SkillNet, and the folks there, Gillian and Sarah in particular, who've been helping out today and with all the logistics for this event. I just want to say a huge thank you. We couldn't do it without you, so it's a marvelous piece of work from them. And thank you so much for doing it. I also want to say to everyone on the call here today, if you want to get more involved, if you want to join our community to hear more about the trends, we heard a lot about trends in open source here today. We heard a lot about intent in Ireland, about how we can improve and get better and get more involved. And it's a very fast evolving space. So if you are interested in hearing more of those trends and getting more up to date, but even more importantly, helping out and helping us address some of these challenges that we've heard today, but perhaps also some of the opportunities we've heard about today, then please join us at openirelandnetwork.com. There's a mailing list there that you can sign up to. We've also just launched a skills survey because the skills angle is so important, covering not just the technical skills, but some of what's been described here today in terms of the collaboration skills, business, and all sorts of different skills from that perspective. So we'd really appreciate people's input in that. And we look forward to seeing you in the openirelandnetwork.com, in the mailing list for our next event. And in the meantime, I wish you all a very good day, and thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I'll say goodbye and hope to see you next time. Thanks, everyone.